There is no war exception in the Constitution. It doesn't exist. And again, all you have to do is read the Constitution, and if anybody can find anywhere in there that says, after it lists all the guarantees and rights that we have and all the restrictions that the government has, except in times of war, I will give you some huge prize. When I first started writing about politics, I would spend a lot of time confronting supporters of the Bush administration, and especially the radical theories of executive power that they had adopted. And invariably, what the debate always came down to, once it turned out that it was obvious that there was no legal authority for what they were saying and no constitutional authority for what they were saying, it was always the same argument. And the argument was, well, we're in a time of war. We're a nation of war. And I actually became convinced, and I still to this day think that this is true, that a lot of those right-wing followers at the time actually believe that there's two versions of the Constitution, one that says this is the one for peace and one that says this is the one for war. And I would actually be a little bit sympathetic to this argument that, well, we have to loosen up the Constitution or decide that we're not going to follow it in times of war. If it had been the case, if it were the case, the people who wrote the Constitution just didn't really think about war and didn't realize that we might be at war one day. And so the argument would be, well, they just didn't know war, they didn't think about war, so we have to accommodate the wars that we're fighting. But if anyone knew war, it was them. Not only did they fight one to form the country, they started fighting several very quickly after that as well. And yet they, in writing this Constitution, knowing how extreme of a circumstance war is, did not bother to include any provision suggesting that any of these restrictions on government power are suspended or modified or diluted during time of war. And I think that's pretty significant, in fact, dispositive, because it's really one of the most pernicious ideas in our political culture. This idea that if we're at war, then our liberties are suspended and government power is no longer restricted. And the reason that's so odious is because it would be bad enough if we were a country that, periodically now and then, like once every decade or 20 years or so, went to war. And then we would have to suffer once or twice a decade for a couple of years the suspension of the Constitution and dilution of these liberties. But that isn't what the United States is. The United States policy is what Andrew Bacevich, who's a military historian and retired Army colonel, calls a posture of endless war. We're always at war. And we've been at war since World War II, continuously. We are never a nation at peace. Even the times that we tell ourselves that we're a nation at peace, if you look at how people talk about Bill Clinton and his presidency, they talk about him like he was a peacetime president. And the idea was once the Soviet Union fell, we were going to start reaping the peacetime dividend. And yet Bill Clinton lobbed missiles at the Sudan and Afghanistan and fought major wars in the Balkans and oversaw occupation of Somalia. We're always fighting wars. We're always intervening in other countries. Right now we're fighting no fewer than 5 wars in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, and Libya. And so if you accept the idea that war justifies a dilution and suspension of the Constitution, then what you're really saying is the Constitution, in effect, no longer exists.